The letter trembled in Fiona Abbott's hands as the stagecoach rattled across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory. The year was 1875, and she was a day's journey from meeting the man she'd agreed to marry, a stranger whose promises of paradise on paper had been her salvation from a life that had become unbearable. "Last stop before Willow Creek, madam," the driver called down. "We'll be arriving by sundown tomorrow." Fiona tucked the letter back into her reticule, her fingers lingering on the worn edges of the paper that had traveled 3,000 miles from Wyoming to Boston. 32 years old and a widow, she had responded to an advertisement in the newspaper seeking a bride for a cattle rancher in the West. After exchanging letters for 4 months, she had agreed to marry him. The stagecoach lurched, and Fiona grabbed the leather strap hanging from the ceiling. Across from her, an older woman with silver-streaked hair smiled sympathetically. "First time in the West, dear?" the woman asked. Fiona nodded, adjusting her bonnet. "Yes, madam." "Mail-order bride?" The woman's question held no judgment, only curiosity. Fiona stiffened slightly but nodded again. There was no point in hiding it. "Yes. I'm to marry a rancher in Willow Creek." "Brave girl," the woman said, patting Fiona's hand. "I came out as a bride myself 30 years ago. Never regretted it, though it wasn't what I expected." "What was different?" Fiona asked, suddenly hungry for insight. The woman laughed softly. "Everything, child. Everything." That night, as they stopped at a way station, Fiona unfolded the letter once more by candlelight. The promises leapt from the page: a beautiful 2-story ranch house with glass windows and real wooden floors, herds of cattle stretching to the horizon, servants to help with the household, and a life of comfort that would make her forget all her troubles back east. The signature at the bottom read, "Yours faithfully, Keith Parker." His handwriting was strong and confident, just as she imagined him to be. The stagecoach arrived in Willow Creek the following evening. The town was smaller than Fiona had expected: a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a smattering of other buildings. No cobblestone streets like Boston. No grand houses. Just dust and simplicity. A tall man stepped forward as she descended from the coach. His face was tanned from the sun, his eyes the color of faded denim. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with early gray at the temples. "Miss Abbott?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. Fiona smoothed her travel-worn dress. "Yes." "Mr. Parker?" He nodded, not smiling but not unfriendly either. He looked to be in his late 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and wind. "Welcome to Willow Creek." He gestured to a wagon parked nearby. "I've got your trunk loaded. It's about an hour to the ranch." As they drove out of town, Fiona took in the vast, open landscape. The rolling plains stretched endlessly, interrupted occasionally by rocky outcroppings and sparse trees. It was beautiful in its wildness, but nothing like the lush paradise Keith had described in his letters. "Your letters," she began hesitantly. "They painted quite a picture of your ranch." Keith's hands tightened on the reins. "About that," he said, not looking at her, "I need to be honest with you before we go any further." Fiona's stomach clenched. "Honest? The man who wrote those letters, that wasn't me." Keith's voice was flat, emotionless. "That was my brother Kenneth. He placed the advertisement, handled the correspondence. I only found out about it a month ago when he died of fever." The air left Fiona's lungs. "Your brother? But the letters were signed Keith Parker, yes." "Kenneth wrote as me. He was trying to help, in his way. I've been alone since my wife died 5 years ago." Fiona stared at his profile, trying to process the information. "So everything in the letters. Exaggerated at best," Keith said, finally meeting her gaze. "I have a ranch, but it's struggling. The house is simple 4 rooms, not 2 stories. I have 20 head of cattle, not hundreds. And there are no servants. Just me and occasionally a hired hand when I can afford it." Fiona felt her dreams crumbling. "Why did you still bring me here, then? Why not write and tell me the truth? Keith looked away again. I considered it. But Kenneth had paid your passage already, and… He sighed. And I thought maybe you needed this new start as much as I did. The letters you wrote, they seemed like you were running from something too. The wagon crested a hill, and in the valley below, Fiona could see a small cabin with a barn and corral beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a few cattle grazed in a nearby pasture. It was humble, painfully so compared to what she'd been promised. I'll take you back to town tomorrow if you want, Keith said. Put you on the next stage east. I won't hold you to any promises you made based on lies. Fiona was silent, her mind racing. She had sold everything to come west, spent her last dollars on this journey. But it wasn't just financial desperation that had driven her, it was escape. Escape from the whispers that followed her after her husband Thomas had taken his own life, leaving her with debts and scandal. Escape from the pitying looks and the subtle blame in people's eyes, as if she should have seen it coming, should have stopped it somehow. Let me stay the night, she said finally. And I'll decide in the morning. Keith nodded, flicking the reins to urge the horses down the hill. The cabin was clean but sparse. A main room with a stone fireplace served as both kitchen and living area. 2 small bedrooms branched off from it, and a lean-to at the back held tools and supplies. Keith showed her to the smaller bedroom, which had clearly been hastily prepared for her arrival. It was Kenneth's room, he explained. I've put fresh linens on the bed. Fiona set her small traveling case on a wooden chair. Thank you. I'll make supper, Keith said awkwardly. You must be hungry after your journey. Left alone, Fiona sank onto the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry silently. The tears were not just for the deception or the humble conditions, but for all she had left behind and all she had hoped to find. Supper was a simple affair of beans, corn bread, and coffee. Keith ate quietly, occasionally glancing at her as if trying to gauge her thoughts. How did your brother die? Fiona asked, breaking the silence. Keith set down his fork. Fever took him quick. 3 days from first symptoms to his last breath. Doc couldn't do anything for him. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you? Keith hesitated. May I ask what brought you to answer a marriage advertisement? Your letter suggested you had some education, refinement. Fiona stared into her coffee cup. My husband died a year ago. He left substantial debts. And a tarnished name. How so? He took his own life. Fiona said, the words still painful to speak aloud. After his business failed. People talked. They blamed me for not noticing his despair, for not saving him somehow. Keith's face softened. That's a heavy burden to bear. Yes. Fiona looked up at him. So you see, I have nowhere to return to. But I also didn't come west to be a charity case. Keith leaned back in his chair. I don't see it as charity. I need help here, real help. The work is hard, the rewards often small. But it's honest work, and this land. He gestured toward the window. This land has a way of healing, if you give it time. Are you proposing we still marry? Fiona asked directly. No, Keith replied, surprising her. At least, not right away. I'm proposing you stay as my housekeeper, if you like. I'll pay you a fair wage. Give yourself time to know the real place, the real me. Then decide if you want more. Fiona considered his offer. It wasn't what she had traveled across the country for, but it was honest. And perhaps honesty was what she needed most after years of living with a husband whose despair she hadn't recognized until it was too late. I accept, she said finally. For now. The first weeks were difficult. Fiona's hands, soft from city living, blistered as she learned to cook on a wood stove, to wash clothes in a metal tub, to tend a vegetable garden that provided much of their food. Keith was often gone from dawn until dusk, working with the cattle or repairing fences or hunting to supplement their meals. But there was also beauty in those early days. Sunsets that painted the sky in colors Fiona had never seen in Boston. The satisfaction of kneading bread dough with her strengthening hands. The quiet evenings when Keith would read aloud from one of the few books he owned while she mended clothes by the fire. One evening in late June, nearly a month after her arrival, Fiona was hanging laundry on the line when she heard gunshots in the distance. Alarmed, she shaded her eyes and saw Keith running toward the house from the direction of the creek, his rifle in hand. "Get inside!" he shouted as he drew closer. "Lock the door!" Fiona dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran to the cabin. Once inside, she bolted the door as instructed and peered anxiously through the window. Keith was still running, occasionally turning to fire towards something or someone she couldn't see. He reached the cabin, and she quickly unbolted the door to let him in. "Rustlers," he panted, reloading his rifle. "3 of them. They've driven off half my herd. Should we send for the sheriff?" Fiona asked, her heart pounding. Keith shook his head grimly. Willow Creek's sheriff is 70 years old and 3 hours away. By the time he got here, those cattle would be across the territory line. "Then what can we do?" Keith checked his ammunition. "I'm going after them." "Alone? Against 3 armed men?" Fiona felt fear rise in her throat. "That's suicide, Keith. Those cattle represent everything I have," Keith said, his voice hard. "Without them, I can't make it through winter." Fiona grabbed his arm. "Then I'm coming with you." Keith stared at her. "Absolutely not. I can't shoot," Fiona said firmly. "My father taught me when I was a girl. And 2 guns are better than 1. Keith looked like he wanted to argue further, but a distant shout changed his mind. "They're splitting up with the herd," he said, peering out the window. "We need to move now if we're going to catch them." Minutes later, they were on horseback, Keith on his stallion and Fiona on the gentler mare he kept for working close to the herd. Keith had given her his old revolver, keeping the rifle for himself. They rode hard for nearly an hour, following tracks that led toward a narrow canyon. As they approached, Keith held up his hand for silence, then dismounted and motioned for Fiona to do the same. "They've penned the cattle in the box canyon," he whispered. "Probably planning to move them after dark. 2 men with the herd, 1 likely keeping watch." "What's your plan?" Fiona whispered back, clutching the revolver. "Create a distraction. Get them away from the herd long enough for the cattle to scatter. They'll head home if they're not contained." They separated, Keith moving toward the canyon entrance while Fiona circled around to approach from higher ground. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain anyone nearby would hear it. She had never been in a situation like this, never imagined she would be crawling on her belly through sagebrush, a gun in her hand, preparing to confront cattle thieves. From her vantage point, she could see the men Keith had described. 2 were lounging by a small fire at the mouth of the canyon, while a third stood watch from a rocky outcropping. The stolen cattle milled restlessly in the enclosed space beyond. A sharp whistle split the air, Keith's signal. Immediately, Fiona aimed her revolver at the sky and fired twice. The shots echoed through the canyon, and the cattle began to bellow in alarm. The men below jumped to their feet, grabbing their weapons. 1 ran toward the cattle, while the other 2 began scanning the ridgelines. "Up there!" one shouted, pointing in Fiona's direction. Before she could react, a bullet struck the rock beside her head. Fiona ducked down, heart racing. This was real. These men would kill her without hesitation. Another shot rang out, this one from Keith's position. One of the rustlers cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 returned fire, and soon the air was filled with the crack of gunshots and the panicked lowing of cattle. In the chaos, the herd began to move, pushing against the makeshift barrier the rustlers had erected. The wooden poles gave way, and suddenly 20 head of cattle were thundering out of the canyon, directly toward the rustlers' position. The men scattered, trying to avoid being trampled. Keith used the moment to charge forward, firing his rifle. 1 rustler threw down his gun and raised his hands. The other turned to flee but was caught by the edge of the stampeding herd and knocked to the ground. When it was over, 1 rustler was wounded, 1 unconscious, and 1 surrendering. Keith quickly bound their hands while Fiona kept the revolver trained on them, her arms shaking from adrenaline. "We need to get them to town," Keith said, his face grim but triumphant. "The sheriff may be old, but he can still lock up rustlers." It was past midnight when they finally returned to the ranch, having delivered the thieves to the sheriff and recovered most of the cattle. Fiona was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, her muscles aching, her mind still racing with images of the confrontation. As they unsaddled the horses in the barn, Keith turned to her. "You were brave today," he said quietly. "Braver than most men I know." Fiona's hands stilled on the saddle strap. "I was terrified." "Being brave isn't about not feeling fear," Keith said. "It's about acting despite it." He hesitated. "When that bullet hit near you, I thought..." His voice broke. "I thought I'd lost you before I ever really had you." Fiona looked up at him, seeing something new in his eyes, vulnerability, and something else she hadn't noticed before. "You haven't lost me," she said softly. "I'm still here." Keith stepped closer, his hand reaching up to gently touch her cheek. "Fiona, I know this isn't the paradise you were promised. But I swear to you, I'll work every day to make it a place worth staying." "It already is," Fiona whispered, and when Keith's lips met hers, she felt something inside her begin to heal a wound she'd carried since finding Thomas's body, a guilt she'd nurtured like a sick child. As summer turned to fall, Fiona and Keith fell into a rhythm of work and quiet companionship. The ranch was still struggling, but Keith's honest approach to their challenges made them seem less insurmountable. Together, they repaired the cabin roof before the first rains, preserved vegetables from the garden for winter, and prepared the livestock for the colder months ahead. Their relationship evolved slowly, built on respect rather than the romantic fantasies that had brought Fiona west. Keith never pressed for marriage, true to his word that she should have time to know the real place and the real man. In October, Fiona received a letter from Boston, a former neighbor writing to inform her that Thomas's business partner had confessed to embezzlement. The revelation changed everything about her husband's suicide. It hadn't been just failure that drove him to it, but betrayal by someone he trusted. The news should have brought relief, vindication even, but instead it opened the wounds of grief anew. Keith found her sobbing at the kitchen table, the letter crumpled in her hand. "What is it?" he asked, alarmed. "Bad news from home?" Through tears, Fiona explained the contents of the letter. Keith listened silently, then knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his. "You've been carrying this burden alone for too long," he said gently. "Blaming yourself for not seeing what no one could have seen." "I was his wife," Fiona said brokenly. "I should have known something was wrong." "And I was Kenneth's brother," Keith replied. "Should I have known he was writing to you in my name? Should I have somehow sensed he was going to fall ill and die?" He shook his head. "We can't carry the weight of what we couldn't have known, Fiona. It will crush us." Fiona looked into his eyes, seeing the wisdom there, and the pain of his own losses. "How did you move forward after your wife died?" Keith's thumb traced circles on her hand. "One day at a time. Some days were harder than others. But eventually, I realized that living in grief wasn't honoring her memory, it was wasting the life she would have wanted me to have." That night, Fiona made a decision. When Keith came in from his evening chores, she was waiting by the fire, a simple supper on the table and determination in her heart. "I don't want to be your housekeeper anymore," she said without preamble. Keith froze in the doorway, his face falling. "I see. I understand if you want to leave." "No," Fiona interrupted, stepping closer to him. "I don't want to leave. I want to be your wife. If you'll still have me." The smile that spread across Keith's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains. "Are you certain? This life, it's not what you came expecting." "It's better," Fiona said firmly. "It's real. You never promised me paradise, Keith. You promised me honesty. And in that honesty, I've found something I never expected to find again: peace." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Willow Creek. The ceremony was simple, attended by the few neighbors from surrounding ranches and the townspeople who had come to respect the quiet rancher and his eastern bride. Winter came early that year, blanketing the plains in snow and testing the preparations they had made. The cabin that had seemed so humble to Fiona upon her arrival now felt like a sanctuary against the howling winds and freezing temperatures. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, they sat before the fire, Keith carving a piece of wood while Fiona worked on a quilt. "Do you ever regret it?" Keith asked suddenly. "Coming west? Finding out the truth? Staying anyway?" Fiona considered the question seriously. "I regret that I was deceived," she said finally. "But not by you, by my own expectations. I came west looking for an escape, a perfect new life that would erase all the pain of my old one." She set down her sewing. "What I found instead was the strength to face that pain, to move through it rather than running from it. And I found you." Keith set aside his carving and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "When Kenneth was dying, he confessed what he'd done. I was furious at first that he'd created this obligation, this expectation I couldn't possibly fulfill. But now I think it was his last gift to me. To us." "A strange gift," Fiona said with a small smile. "Built on deception. But ending in truth," Keith replied, taking her hand. "And sometimes that's how the best stories go." The winter of 1875-1876 was one of the harshest in memory. 2 of their cattle died despite their best efforts, and for weeks they were snowed in, unable to reach town for supplies. They survived on what they had preserved and what Keith could hunt on the rare clear days. By spring, Fiona had discovered she was with child. The news brought both joy and anxiety. A baby meant another mouth to feed, another life dependent on the success of their struggling ranch. But spring also brought opportunity. The railroad was expanding westward, and the new line would pass just 20 miles from their property. With it came increased demand for beef to feed the workers. Keith secured a contract to provide meat for the railroad camp, a steady income that allowed them to hire help and expand their herd. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born on a clear September evening in 1876, with the help of a neighboring rancher's wife who had experience as a midwife. Keith paced outside the bedroom door until the infant's cries joined Fiona's exhausted but triumphant ones. When he was finally allowed in, the sight of Fiona holding their daughter tiny, red-faced, with a dusting of dark hair brought tears to his eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek. "She is," Fiona agreed, her face radiant despite the ordeal of childbirth. "And she's ours. Our little piece of paradise." Keith looked startled. "Paradise? After all this time, you'd call this place that?" Fiona smiled up at him. "Not the place, Keith. This us. Our family. The life we've built together." She took his hand and placed it on their daughter's small chest, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath. "This is the paradise I was really looking for, even if I didn't know it." By Elizabeth's first birthday, the ranch had prospered enough to allow for improvements to the cabin. Keith added 2 more rooms, a proper bedroom for their daughter, and a small parlor where Fiona began giving reading lessons to neighboring children whose families couldn't afford to send them to the school in town. The struggles didn't end. There were still harsh winters, threats from rustlers, illnesses, and the 1,000 natural challenges of ranch life. But facing them together made them bearable, even strengthening the bond between them. In the spring of 1878, nearly 3 years after Fiona had first stepped off the stagecoach in Willow Creek, she stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching Keith play with Elizabeth in the new grass. Their second child was growing inside her, just beginning to make its presence known in the gentle rounding of her belly. She thought back to the letter that had brought her west, the promises of a paradise that had turned out to be a humble ranch struggling to survive. Had Kenneth known that his deception would ultimately lead to this moment of quiet joy? Had he somehow sensed that what his brother needed wasn't a refined Eastern lady expecting luxury, but a woman seeking healing and willing to work for a future they would build together? Keith looked up and caught her watching them. His smile, now so familiar, so dear to her, spread across his face. He whispered something to Elizabeth, who immediately began toddling toward Fiona with her arms outstretched. "Mama! Up!" the little girl demanded, reaching Fiona's skirts. Fiona bent to lift her daughter, feeling the solid weight of the child against her chest, the whisper of the spring breeze against her face, the gentle movement of new life within her. This was not the paradise she had been promised. It was better. It was real. And as Keith joined them on the porch, wrapping his arms around both of them, Fiona knew with absolute certainty that the truth, however difficult, had been the greatest gift he could have given her. In his honesty, she had found not an escape from her past, but the strength to heal from it, and in that healing, she had found a love deeper and more enduring than any fantasy could have provided. "Happy?" Keith murmured against her hair. Fiona turned her face up to his, meeting his kiss with a fullness of heart she had once thought impossible to feel again. "Yes," she said simply. "Completely." And in the vast Wyoming landscape that had once seemed so alien and harsh to her Eastern eyes, Fiona Abbott Parker was finally, truly home.